Yeah, make it as little as possible.
All right.
Hi.
Hello, everybody. No. Just very quickly, I'm Jonathan Duda. I'm the director here, and I'm welcome to the cottage today, and for toughing out the hot weather. And there's a nice breeze blowing. Hopefully, it continues to breeze blow, and
hopefully we will continue to breathe.
Yes. And I'd like to welcome you to the name of the program is the Diminutive Engine Wheezed Along.
Wheezed Along,
exactly.
Yeah.
And I can't say that we've had diminutive in any of our events at all, but the title comes from a just a piece in an article. I've seen it in a couple books referring to the rail line that came up the mountain. Came up the mountain here.
And it's not a prison break, that's the noon whistle.
That is. That means it's time for Steve to speak. So, without any more delay, I'd like to introduce you to Steve Trimm. Again, thank you very much for coming.
It's okay. It's okay. No panic. Let's wait for that to stop. Okay. I will be talking about the railroad, and I also will be talking about the man who built the railroad, W.J.R. Kell. When I started researching the railroad, I only glanced at his name really, but as I did a little more research, he turned into one of the great bit players associated with Grant Cottage. So I will be sharing his story as well as the story of the railroad itself. Jonathan referred to an article. Here is exactly what it said, and it was from the New York Times, June 15th or 16th. What does it say on a historical marker? Grant got here on the 15th or 16th of June.
16th.
Okay, it was a description of the arrival of the Grant family on the narrow gauge railway from Saratoga. And the New York Times said this: as the diminutive engine wheezed along the uneven rails up the steep grade, she belched out clouds of stifling smoke, which filled the car and gave the general much annoyance. Curve followed curve in quick succession, and the car pitched from side to side like a boat on a stormy sea. Clearly, the man who wrote the article was not on the train, because he only got it half right. What he got right was the cars were open, and ash and smoke from the little engine did drift into the cars. And when General Grant got off the train, he was covered in ash and soot, and there are descriptions of his valet, combing the ash and soot off his clothing and out of his beard. It was not the most pleasant trip in the world from Saratoga. But then again, it wasn't a pleasant trip from New York either. The Grants left that city for the fresh air of Mount McGregor because Grant's health was failing. As you know, he was dying. And a heat wave was hitting the city. And they wanted him out of there, his doctors did, on the theory that fresh mountain air would prolong his life. And that heat wave followed the train up the Hudson Valley. There was a thermometer in one of the train cars, and when the train reached Albany, it was 100 degrees inside the car. This was a very rough trip for General Grant. It really was. Where to begin? You would assume that the railroad was built to service the great hotel on the mountaintop. The year before Grant came here, the Balmoral Hotel was built right up where the prison softball field is now. And you would think logically to connect the tourists in Saratoga with the great hotel, they would build a railroad. Actually, it's the reverse. The railroad came first. And as an aside, we at Grant Cottage spare no expense to bring history to life. 150 years ago this month, July, General Grant and his army seized Vicksburg, and the weather conditions were exactly like this. So we are recreating Vicksburg for you for the afternoon. You're not going to buy that, are you?
No.
Okay. Never mind. What came first was the railroad. And here is the story of that. It was September of 1881 when a group of very wealthy gentlemen came up here and they went out to the overlook. The overlook's about 100 yards through the trees, and on a clear day you have a spectacular view of the Hudson Valley, and on the clearest days you can see far into the Green Mountains in Vermont. Today, sorry, you're out of luck, it's much too hazy. Take my word for it though, especially in the autumn, the view is, it's just lovely. And it was in the autumn that these gentlemen came up here. The party consisted of W.J. Arkell, his father James, his brother Bartlett, and a gentleman from Saratoga named Albert Spencer. Now Spencer was involved in what was then called the Saratoga Clubhouse. It's now called the Canfield Casino. And if the name Arkell rings a bell, you probably associate it with Canajoharie and the Art Museum. It is the same family, the Arkells. Now the Arkells brought along a friend from Amsterdam named Kellogg, who also was a very wealthy businessman. Well, they walked down to the overlook, and W.J. was just stunned by the view. He would later say that he thought he had discovered the handsomest spot, to my way of thinking, in America. And on the spot, so the legend goes, Mr. Kellogg challenged him to build a railroad to this scenic spot. And the legend has it that everyone in the party pledged $25,000 right then and there. And W.J. would eventually come up with another $1 million for the larger project of building the railroad and the great hotel. I don't know if that's literally true, but in the absence of other information, I'll accept it. The mountaintop belonged to Duncan McGregor. It's Mount McGregor after all. And this group of businessmen purchased the property from McGregor for $50,000. In February 1882, this group of really Gilded Age rich men chartered the Saratoga, Mount McGregor, and Lake George Railroad. They did have big plans. They thought they would possibly go on to Lake George. In the end, it didn't happen. But February 1882, they get the charter to build the railroad. The building begins in March 1882. And the man who was supervising construction was a fellow named John McGee, who got the job done within 4 months. By July 1882, the line is finished from Saratoga to Mount McGregor. You might think this was a challenge, especially when the line finally reached the mountain and had to snake its way up here. But Mr. McGee was an engineer of some renown. He had actually built railroads in the Andes Mountains. So this was a piece of cake, as far as he was concerned. Now, once the railroad was built, Arkell went back to Albany to get the charter enlarged. He had a lot of influence. Among other things, he owned a newspaper in Albany, which the politicians, how can I say this and be politically correct, they groveled in front of the editorial page of this newspaper. So when Arkell went back to Albany to have the charter enlarged so that he could build a hotel up here, no opposition at all. No opposition at all. And in 1883, construction begins on the Balmoral Hotel. It's going to be a resort complex. The work was done within a year. The work was over with in the construction on the hotel began early in 1883 and was finished in 1884. And the Balmoral was state-of-the-art, cutting-edge technology. It had something hardly ever seen in America called electricity. You think 1883, 1884, that's kind of early for experiments with electricity. But this was really the beginning of a new era. And the railroad was involved in some experiments with electricity as well. In 1883, on that first mile of track coming out of Saratoga, there was an experiment with an electric locomotive. A third rail was put in between the two main rails. a wire connecting the third rail with a powerhouse somewhere. The engine was called the Amphier. It was put together by a guy named Leo Draft. So he has his electric locomotive on the rails and a passenger car connected to the locomotive by a rope, which seems to me a little backward, but not everything was cutting-edge technology. And away they go on that first mile. And it seemed to work very well, that first mile out of Saratoga. No glitches at all. Well, on the return run, they'd gone a quarter of a mile, and they took a turn too quickly, and the engine went off the rails, totally destroyed the engine. The passenger car partially derailed. Passengers were thrown out. There were 50 passengers on that run. Many were injured, nobody killed. But that was the end of the experiment with the electric locomotive in Saratoga. But it was on the Mount McGregor line, and so it's a little sideline on our history, I'd say. Where did the line begin in Saratoga? Are most of you folks from around here, do you know Saratoga?
Yes.
Okay, you know Broadway,
Yeah.
and you know where it changes over into North Broadway?
Yes.
Allegedly, the depot for the Mount McGregor rail line was right there at that intersection, just on the North Broadway side. Now we have some maps here. One of our Grant Cottage volunteers went down to Ballston Spa, and he found these maps from the Mount McGregor Railroad days. And he photocopied them for us. And you can follow the line from Saratoga up here, but we also have some close-ups of Saratoga proper, which gives you a pretty good idea of where the depot was. And yes, the weights holding down the maps are spikes from our little narrow gauge railway. Now, the construction, I told you, was a piece of cake, but things changed geologically, at the foot of the mountain. I have here, I know you can't see it from where you are, but after the talk, if you want to come up, it's a geological map of New York State. And here it shows a tongue of well, I don't know. What I'm saying is that all of this is the Adirondacks. And there is a little arm spreading southward, very narrow. Mount McGregor is considered the southernmost peak of the Adirondacks, geologically. Meaning, when they were building here, they hit granite. And it was a little tougher than on the flat ground between here and Saratoga. But, Mr. McGee had worked in the Adirondacks, so for him it was not a huge challenge. Okay. The railroad's finished. The Great Hotel is finished in 1883. 1884, it opens for business, and the railroad begins shuttling passengers up here. It's hard to describe the route. A lot of it was Route 9, near Route 9. But if you look at the map, you'll see where it finally diverged off of Route 9 and took a very circuitous path up the mountain. Many wide turns coming up here. But in any case, the right-of-way is right there. And we have many maps now of where the railroad right-of-way was. Let me see. What's the most logical thing to do? Yes. I do have some maps here, which are a little easier to interpret than those maps, which show the right-of-way out of Saratoga coming up the valley and onto Mount McGregor. Now you would think, with all the research in the world, that these maps would be definitive. And I'm here to tell you, they're not. This map, showing the end of the line up here on Mount McGregor, pinpoints the Mount McGregor station right over there. We who have been here for a while are convinced that the depot was right down there, almost in front of our visitor center. The fellow that did this map is a fairly good researcher, but I'm not sure he knew what he was looking at least when he got up here. There is a photograph. I wish I could have reproduced it for you, but I was unable to download it and make a copy. When General Grant got here in 1885, he walked from the depot, or he tried to. He collapsed partway across the lawn and they had to carry him in. But he walked underneath an arch which said, "Welcome our hero." And there is a photograph of that arch, which clearly was taken down there, looking up the hill, suggesting that the depot really was down there. What you have in the woods now, as you walk down to the overlook, there is a path you will cross. It looks like a hiking path maybe, but that's actually the roadbed of the railroad. And it goes for another 1/10 of a mile through the woods, comes to a ravine, a very sharp drop off. And we know that the storage shed for the engines was on the lip of the ravine. According to this map, the depot was almost on top of the storage shed. Maybe, but I'm just not sure. The information is contradictory. So these maps are pretty good, but I don't think we've settled the argument on where the Mount McGregor depot really was. So it's an ongoing mystery. Here's some statistics related to our little railroad. When it began to operate, it had 3 engines, 7 passenger cars, a baggage car, and 4 freight platforms, which I think were just flat, open air cars, just who knows what they used them for sure. The charter for the railroad was to Lake George, 25 miles, but it was never finished to Lake George. The line from Saratoga to Mount McGregor ran 10.5 miles, and it had about half a mile of sidings here and there. The maximum grade, I'm told, on the line was 212 feet to the mile. The steepest incline was 4.1%, which doesn't sound like much, but once you got up and could view the valley, and in those days a lot of these trees have been logged off, you really did have some spectacular views on the train ride. I think you felt like you were going up into the clouds. The line lasted many years. One of its best years was 1890. And I get these statistics from Poor's Manual of Railroads, 1868 to 1894, 1895 to 1917. Now this was one of the best years for the railroad. It carried passengers 13,000 miles. The number of passengers carried round trip from Saratoga up here and then back, almost 22,000. Passengers carried 1 mile, 215,000. It turned out that folks living between Wilton and Saratoga liked to take the train into Saratoga to go shopping. I'm not sure that the developers pictured this, but many of the folks around here rode comparatively short distances. The railroad in 1890, again, this was one of its best years. It earned a little over $10,000 carrying passengers, a mere $25 carrying mail, about $500, who knows for what. And its operating expenses for 1890 were a little over $9,000, meaning that its net earnings for that year were about $1,200. And this is one of the best years. Essentially, the railroad was breaking even. And Mr. Arkell, I think, did not really see the railroad as a money-making venture. He saw it as a means to an end, which was to get the tourists up to the hotel. So for a while, he could live with the railroad breaking even and doing no better than that. But I'll elaborate on that in a minute. Let me talk a little bit about what we mean by narrow gauge and standard gauge railroads. The gauge is measured, it's the distance really between the two rails. Standard gauge is this. If I can get this up here, a little visual aid. That is 4 feet 8.5 inches, standard gauge. narrow gauge is anywhere between 2 feet and 3 feet 6 inches. Our railroad was 3 feet exactly. Now, what are the pluses and minuses of the different gauges? Come on, come on. That wasn't nearly as exciting as I thought it would be. Well, first of all, about standard gauge. There's been an American myth that the standard gauge for our railroads was derived from the width between the wagon wheels on covered wagons. A very American idea. And I love it a lot, but it's wrong. Standard gauge was created in England when the first commercial railroad was built in 1830. A fellow named Stevenson figured out the width between the rails that would afford the most stability for the cars. And for a while it was called the Stevenson gauge. But that was the first mainline railroad in the world, and it ran between Liverpool and Manchester, which knocks out our lovely covered wagon story. And I'm kind of sad about that. Now, a narrow gauge railroad is cheaper to build. The small cars, engines and cars, can negotiate sharper turns than the bigger trains. It has advantages, but the disadvantages are that operating costs for a little railroad like this are higher because they can carry only smaller loads than the bigger trains and fewer passengers than the bigger trains. The standard gauge railroads really were more stable. They could carry more products and people, and generally they were money makers. Whereas these little guys, breaking even was about the most you could expect. And I think Arkell, being a good businessman, he understood that. The only time the little railroad really carried a lot of items, materials, was when the hotel was being built, which makes sense. You don't want to bring all your lumber up from Saratoga in a horse and cart. Bringing that up by train did make sense. Many of these little trains operated in mountainous country, like I say, because they could take corners better than the bigger trains. Things went along fairly well for a few years with our little railroad servicing the hotel. But then the Panic of 1893 hit. And the Panic of 1893 actually involved railroads. Railroads were overbuilt in this country. There were too many of them. Their financing was shaky. And in 1893, many of the railroads went bankrupt. And it was a domino effect. February 1893, the Philadelphia and Reading Railroad declared bankruptcy. And within a few weeks, the Northern Pacific, the Union Pacific, the Atchison, Topeka, and Santa Fe, big roads, also declared bankruptcy. In the end, 500 banks failed, 15,000 companies associated with the railroads went out of business, unemployment skyrocketed, coal miners suddenly were out of work. There was no more need for coal for all these trains. So the coal miners went on strike and there was chaos in the Midwest. The Pullman cars, which were the great dining cars, sleeping cars, they were just extravagantly beautiful railroad cars. There was suddenly no need for them anymore. So Mr. Pullman told his workers, I'm cutting your pay by 25%. So of course they went on strike, and workers in Allied railroads followed them, and the entire transportation network in America stopped. 1893 was a really bad year, especially for railroads. Little statistics here. In 1890, I gave you the stats for this railroad. One of its best years was 1890. National unemployment was 4%. In 1893, at the start of the panic, national unemployment was 11.7%. And the next year, it was 18.4%. The Panic of 1893 was the worst economic depression that we suffered between the Civil War and the Great Depression. It was an immense economic catastrophe, and the little railroad here and the Balmoral Hotel wound up as victims of it. Now, in the first years of the railroad, W.J. Arkell kind of took a back seat. He had his friend Mr. Kellogg set up as president of the corporation. After a few years, Arkell thought things were going well, and he took on the role of president. He moved the offices of the railroad from his home in Canajoharie to Ballston Spa. But the Panic of 1893, again, some statistics that tell you how bad it was. In 1884, the first year that the railroad operated, in connection with the Balmoral Hotel, profits were $18,000. Not bad. But in 1893, the first year of the Great Panic, profits were only $1,300. This was not economically sustainable, and Arkell saw it coming. In 1891, he divested himself of his interest in the railroad. And then, after the Great Panic set in, he left this corporation entirely. He and his partners sold the Balmoral Hotel to a new set of investors for $50,000. Here's what I mean by bad. When Arkell and the first investors here bought the property from Duncan McGregor, they purchased it for $50,000. And in the meantime, now they had built the great hotel complex up here. When they sold this developed area for only $50,000, that tells you how deep the economic recession and depression, how deep it had gone. They lost money on the hotel. As you may know, the new owners didn't last too long. The hotel burned down under mysterious circumstances in 1897, and they collected $150,000 on the insurance. So for them, it was a money-making proposition. The railroad limped along for another year, and then it was merged with what they called regional lines in the Hudson Valley. Principally, that was a railroad line called the Saratoga Northern, which was made up of many little railroads from the area. The line going down the mountain was closed. No more trains came up here. But the line from basically Wilton to Saratoga stayed in operation to one degree or another. And the Saratoga Northern used that line. And then the Saratoga Northern went under, and there was another merger with little railroads. Did you know that we used to have in this area the Fort Edward Street Railroad, the Warren County Railroad? These were some of the little railroads that merged, hoping to keep railroad business viable. And it didn't work. It really didn't work. But they tried even after this line closed. Mr. Arkell, looking back, now Arkell was involved in many businesses. He was a publisher, he was in meatpacking, all kinds of stuff. Looking back, he would say that during this period, he made more money in the meatpacking business than he did with the Balmoral Hotel Resort, which was a shock. He had theorized that when General Grant was here at Grant Cottage, every day reporters would write stories about General Grant here, and they would mention the great hotel. Ergo, he would get free publicity, and the hotel business would boom. In fact, just the reverse happened. After Grant died, the cottage became a pilgrimage site. Thousands and thousands of Union veterans and their families came here. But it turned out they felt they were in a sacred place, kind of like Arlington National Cemetery. If you visit Arlington National Cemetery, would you want your hotel to be in the middle of the graveyard? No. And it was same with the thousands who came here. They came They paid homage to General Grant, and they did not stay at the hotel. They left the same day. Arkell would say, after the general's death, as people came to the mountain, the moment they stepped off the train, they took off their hats and they walked around on tiptoe, looking for something I could never find. Well, those people that got off the train were looking for something spiritual. Mr. Arkell was looking for profits, so of course he didn't find the same thing. He couldn't see it. The question for today is any of the old roadbed left? And the answer is yes. 20 years ago, 1993 and 94, Lorraine Westcott, who was the Wilton historian, walked the entire line from Saratoga up here. Nowadays, really because of the prison and private ownership of a lot of the right-of-way, you can't do it anymore. But if you know where to look, you can still see traces of the old railroad line. 2 winters ago, the winter we had no snow, I thought it would be the perfect time to start looking for the roadbed. There would be no snow covering it. It wasn't summer. There'd be no foliage obscuring things. So I wandered around up here for a while, and I took some photographs. Now I know you really can't see them, but trust me, after the talk you can come up and you can see the old roadbed. It's still here. And the most beautiful section of it, as far as I'm concerned, when you leave the mountain, you know, there's the guard post down there at the foot.
Yeah.
If you look immediately to your left in the woods, you will see an embankment. And it'll go along southward, or, well, down the mountain for a few hundred yards. Clearly it's man-made. That is part of the old railroad bed. And I think if someday we could get permission to lead a hike, maybe along that portion, we'd get a lot of takers. Anyway, after the talk, when you can come up and get a better look at it, look at the photos. Now, Miss Westcott, when she walked the rail line, on Mount McGregor, there are many small canyons and ravines. And the railroad had to bridge those. Now, we have some photographs on our storyboards and in our slideshow of some of the engines on some of the trestles going over some of the ravines. And when Miss Westcott walked the line, she was able to find the stone foundations for those wooden trestles. Now, I wasn't able to go onto the private property where the foundation stones are, but I was able to find near the road a little stream running along, and there is a culvert there that the stream is running through with stone, an example of the craftsmanship that went into building the railroad. It's just a hint. Someday if I can walk the line and find the ravines with the great foundations, I would love to do that. But so far, no luck on that. Let me see here. I guess that sort of sums up the little narrow gauge railway. It is something I wish with all my heart we still had. I think it would be a great tourist draw. I know the prison people would never accept it because you do have to stop at a checkpoint and answer questions, and if you have a train load of people, that would take forever. What a shame that we've lost that. What a shame. Now, about Mr. Arkell, the businessman who really financed the railroad. I found, not too long ago, a book that Mr. Arkell wrote. It's the story of his life. Old friends and some acquaintances. Now, W.J. Arkell died in 1930. This book was written in 1927. There's no photograph of him. I've never seen a photograph of W.J. Arkell. But he is a character. And I'm going to share some of his stories from this book. When I think of a Gilded Age businessman, I think of someone with no sense of humor at all. But Arkell had this satirical, sarcastic sense of humor that sometimes I found very winning. He admits in this book that he loved General Grant and Mrs. Grant and their daughter Nellie, but he didn't like Grant's sons. He didn't go into any detail as to why not, and that bothers me. I'd like to know why he didn't like them. But here's how much he liked Nellie Grant. Nellie was the first person ever married at the White House. And this was almost like a royal occasion in America. The wedding was followed by the public, like the royals in England almost. And Walt Whitman, the great poet of his era, wrote a poem to Nellie Grant, which Arkell copied for his book. Walt Whitman to Nellie Grant. A kiss for the bride. Sacred, blithesome, undenied, with benisons from east and west, and salutations north and south. Through me, indeed, today, a million hearts and hands wafting a million loves, a million soul-felt prayers, tender and true, remain the arms that shelter thee. Fair winds always fill the ship's sails that sail thee. Dear girl, through me, the ancient privilege too, for the new world through me, the old, old wedding greeting. O youth, O health, O sweet Missouri rose, O bonny bride, yield thy red cheeks, thy lips today, unto a nation's loving kiss. Now, I don't know much about poetry, but I don't think I would have reproduced that poem in my book. But this is the kind of odd character Arkell was. He thought this was lovely. So we'll let that sit there and you can ponder poetry. Here's one of the stories he tells. Arkell was into horse racing. He had horses for 25 years. Some of them won, some of them lost. His trainer was a guy named Louis Elmore, who lived in Sheepshead Bay, down Long Island. The story is this. Arkell has bought a new horse for $250, and he meets with his trainer to discuss the possibilities. And the trainer says, don't even bother naming this horse. He's a loser. He'll never win. Get rid of him. And then the trainer leaves. Now the conversation took place on a great porch like this. And the trainer's little girl, as the conversation was underway, was playing with a neighborhood child. So the trainer and the daughter walk off the porch. And the little child from the neighborhood remains. It's a little girl about 10 years old. She comes up to Mr. Arkell and she says, you haven't named your horse? I said, no. She says, I have an idea. I think you should name your horse Ethelbert. And Arkell says,